I forgot. I'm prepared. I was just involved in my thoughts. I am reading from the Common English Version, which sounds like the way we talk. From Luke 2, verses 41 to 51. Each year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to their custom. After the festival was over, they were returning home, but the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it. Supposing that he was among their band of travelers, they journeyed on for a full day while looking for him among their family and friends. When they didn't find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and putting questions to them. Everyone who had heard him was amazed by his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were shocked. His mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." Jesus replied, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what he said to them. Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. His mother cherished every word in her heart. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I don't know if John or if Rod had this experience when their children were growing up, but at various times during my daughter's growing up years, she informed me that she did not consider herself to be a source of illustrations for my sermons. And she informed me that she would greatly appreciate it if I would realize that as well. But it occurs to me that she's not here this morning. And that maybe what she doesn't know won't hurt me. So if you promise not to tell her, and if she doesn't see it on the YouTube presentation sometime later, I want to share with you this morning an experience that I had with her when she was about 3 years old. We were living in Idaho at the time, but we had made a trip over to Oregon to see my mother. And while we were visiting with my mother, we went to a mall where my mother worked in a dress shop. We dropped my mother at the dress shop where she was working. And then Barbara and Christy and I walked to the other end of the mall where there was a penny store in which we wanted to browse. It was quite a ways down there. It was clear to the other end of the mall. When we got into Penny's, Barbara saw something she wanted to look at. And she went off to look at that. And Christy decided that she wanted to stay with me, and we started walking through the men's department. There in the men's department, I saw a pair of pants that I wanted to try on. And so, because Christy was only 3 years old, I took her into the dressing room with me and pulled the curtain across the dressing room and I had no more than taken the pants I was wearing off, then she decided she was done and slipped under the curtain and out into the store. I, of course, could not go after her until I got my pants back on. That took a couple of minutes, and by the time I got out there into the store, she was no place to be seen. I enlisted the help of some of the clerks, and we began searching for her. They began getting a little frantic. By that time, Barbara had returned to the scene, and she and I were running around the store calling out Christy's name, but she was nowhere to be found and didn't respond to our calling. Finally, the clerks decided we'd better alert the mall security, and they did so. And mall security made an announcement over the PA system in the mall that people should be on the lookout for a little 3-year-old girl who answered to the name of Christy. And just as that announcement was made over the mall PA system, my mother looked up from the cash register in her store, and Christy came walking into her store. She had gone back to where Grandma was. How she knew how to get there, I don't know. We couldn't hardly find our way back. But Barbara and I were immediately informed, that she was safe and in the care of my mother. And when we finally made our way back to the drugstore and into Christy's presence, we gave her quite a little talking to, as you can imagine. But she couldn't see what the problem was. She didn't see what this fuss was all about. She knew where she was. She knew what she was doing. She was going to see Grandma. Wasn't that why we'd come to Oregon in the first place? To see Grandma? Well, it's because of that incident in my own life that I can understand and sympathize with Mary and Joseph and the panic that they must have felt when they realized that Jesus was not among the group with which they were traveling as they returned to Nazareth from the Passover feast. I can only imagine the speed with which Mary and Joseph returned to Jerusalem to look for Jesus. And I expect that every one of us here can understand something of the terror that Mary and Joseph must have felt when they got back there to Jerusalem and they could not find Jesus. You've got to wonder where they were looking for him. You've got to wonder why it took them so long, 3 days, before they looked for him in the temple. I don't know where they were looking. Maybe they were searching the marketplace, looking in various booths where they had seen Jesus interested when they went shopping. Maybe they were searching the campground area where perhaps they stayed when they came to the Passover festival. Maybe there was an area where children played while the adults went off to the Passover festivities. I don't know. All I know is that they could not find him. And when they finally went looking at the temple, I suspect it probably took them a while to find him there at the temple, because I have an idea that the temple was probably something like this building. Do you know how many little nooks and crannies this building has? Do you know how many rooms there are in this building that have another room behind them? I was down there in the basement the other day looking through the rooms of the church, and I found a room where you start out in this room, and then there's another room, and then there's another room, and then there's another room. Yeah, it would be the most wonderful place in the world for a child's game of hide and seek. And maybe it was like that in the temple, and maybe that's why it took them so long to find him. I don't know. All I know is that when they found him talking with the doctors of the law, they were, as Barbara and I were when we found our daughter, both irritated and relieved. And they expressed their concern to Jesus, you can bet. They probably had a talk to him similar to the one that we had with our daughter about how it's possible, for somebody to come along and take, what you would say in those circumstances. But while they were remonstrating with Jesus, he was a little bit irritated with them. He didn't understand why they didn't know where he would be. Like our daughter, he knew where he was and what he was doing. And like our daughter, he was a bit irritated with his parents for not knowing that he would be in the temple going about his Father's business. I suspect that's why Luke included this incident in his gospel. I suspect he included this incident in the gospel in order to give us all some help in the times when we lose Jesus. And make no mistake about it, from time to time, we all lose Jesus. We just can't help but lose Jesus every now and then. I think, for instance, about a woman who is one of my favorite speakers and authors, and her name is Lauren Winner, and she is a Jewish woman who grew up in the Hebrew faith, and through several experiences that she had in her own. And then through reading the Dan Caron's Mitford series of novels, those novels about the Episcopal priest in Mitford, North Carolina. They're delightful novels. If you don't know them, I recommend them to you. Dan Caron's The Mitford series. But through that series of novels, as well as through some experiences she had in the Hebrew faith, Lauren Winner fell in love with Jesus and his church. And her conversion to Christian faith was a dynamic experience in her life, and it set her on fire with the love that she felt for Jesus and the love that she felt for Christian faith and the love that she felt for the church. And for many years after she had this experience, she was simply alive with faith. She, by the way, is a professor of Christian spirituality at Duke Divinity School. And she's written about all of this in a book called Girl Meets God, which I also recommend to you. But after several years of extreme enthusiasm over her faith, something happened to her. Life, as they say, happened to her. Her mother died a sudden death. Her marriage, which had been an unhappy one from the very beginning, fell apart, and she and her husband divorced. And when she turned to an Episcopal priest in her church for help with the difficulty that she was going through, the only help he offered was to ask her if she had been lying when she repeated her wedding vows. As a result of all of that, she found that her faith began to wane. As a result of all the difficulties that she was having in life, what once had been a burning fire now had become an ember that was struggling to stay alive. She calls it her midlife faith crisis, but when she's being really honest, she calls it losing Jesus. I heard her one time talk about this in a sermon that she preached in a church in Nashville, Tennessee. And she said that during this time when the flame of her faith was struggling and threatening to go out, she found great hope in the passage of Scripture that Susan read for us this morning. For one thing, she said, it brought her some comfort that Mary and Joseph lost Jesus, because she figured that if Mary and Joseph could lose Jesus in the temple, then maybe it wasn't so bad that she lost Jesus in the Episcopal Church. She said that she found this passage of Scripture extremely helpful to her because it reminded her that she was not the only one who had ever lost Jesus. In fact, she said, reading that passage of Scripture and thinking about it, she came to understand that it happens to all of us, that we all sometime, someplace in our life, have that experience of losing Jesus, where the ember of our faith begins to flutter and is threatened with extinction. I was interested to hear her say that she thinks it is a tragedy that churches have often developed a culture where it is not okay to admit that you are having that experience. She said, since we all have it, we ought to be able to talk about it once in a while. But she said it's been her experience that even in churches where when you can talk about it and where you admit that you're having that kind of an experience, people will say to you, oh, it's all right. Don't worry about it. We all have that kind of an experience. And then they expect that in 3 weeks you'll be over the experience and you'll be back to firm faith in Jesus. She said we need to be able to admit that our faith is wavering. And sometimes what we really need is we need for other people to say to us, we'll believe for you while you are having a difficult time. Just rely for a while on our belief and we'll believe for you. She says as well that she found great comfort in this text that Susan read for us this morning, because it dawned on her as she listened to that text that Jesus was not really lost. Mary and Joseph thought they had lost Jesus, and from time to time we may think we have lost Jesus, but Jesus is not really lost. He knows where he is, and he knows what he is doing. As he says in our Scripture, he is going about his Father's business. He is not lost. It's something like the experience that was related in an incident that was reported in late October in our Kitsap Sun newspaper. Maybe you remember reading a story there about the Roman Catholic Church, Christ the King Roman Catholic Church in Chicago, Illinois. Maybe you read it because it was on the same page as John's column, and maybe you saw it because I know you always read John's column. I hope you always read John's column in the Kitsap Sun. But there was this story about the Christ the King Roman Catholic Church in Chicago. One morning early in October, 5:45 in the morning, just before some of the parishioners began to arrive for early morning Mass, their church caught fire. And in the long run, 150 firefighters were called to fight this raging blaze. the people of that congregation gathered out on the sidewalk across the street from the church, surrounding their priest as they watched their beloved building in flames. When the flames were finally put out, the floor was soggy with water. The walls were disintegrating from the moisture. The pillars that held up the facility were blackened with soot. Part of the roof had fallen in. And the congregation was standing out there on the sidewalk, feeling disappointed, depressed, and panicked about what they were going to do. Located in the nave of that congregation, there was a statue, a precious statue, cast in the 1700s, and a gift that had come to them from a church in Spain. It was known as the Divine Child, and the people who were members of that Catholic parish referred to this statue as the symbolic centerpiece of their spiritual life. And as they stood out there on the sidewalk, looking at their building nearly destroyed, down the steps of the building came a firefighter carrying that statue wrapped in a blanket, carrying it in his arms. And they discovered when he laid the statue in the arms of the priest that the statue had survived the fire undamaged except for a few places where it was smeared with ash. And when that firefighter laid the statue in the hands of the priest, tears ran down his cheeks, and he said to his congregation, "Jesus is still with us." And he was right, wasn't he? He is right. Jesus is still with us. We may think we have lost him from time to time, but Jesus is still with us. And the real question that we need to ask is not, is Jesus still with us? The real question is simply this: are we still with Jesus? Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Amen.